"There is no one in the North Tower," the housekeeper said too quickly, and the Duke of Bellbrook, who had spent his life reading the faces of people who lied to him, knew at once that there was. Bartholomew had come to Marsden Hall to settle a tedious matter of disputed boundaries with its mistress, the widow who had married into the place and outlived her husband by a dozen cold years. He had not expected to care about anything beneath its damp and ill-kept roof. But as the woman led him through the gallery to discuss her hedgerows and her grievances, he had glanced up through a window and seen, far above in the grim grey tower at the north end of the house, a pale face at a barred slit of glass, there one moment, gone the next, like a candle pinched out. A face, a young woman's face, white as ash, watching the world she was not permitted to enter. "The North Tower is shut up," the widow told him over tea, when he asked. Her name was Mrs. Granger, and her smile did not reach her eyes. "Damp got into it years ago. Nothing up there but old furniture and ruin. I keep it locked for safety." "Of course," Bartholomew said, and drank his tea, and resolved to see the inside of that tower before he left Marsden Hall if he had to tear the door from its hinges himself. He was a patient man when patience served him. He concluded his business slowly, asked to stay the night on the pretext of a lame carriage horse, and let the house fall quiet around him. And when the candles were doused and the widow had gone to her bed, the Duke of Bellbrook took a single lantern from the hall and climbed. The north stair was cold in a way the rest of the house was not, a deep stone cold that crept through his boots into his bones. The steps wound up and up, past landings thick with dust no servant had disturbed in months. At the top he found a heavy door bound in black iron, and across it, fitted into a great old lock, the dull gleam of an iron key that someone had left turned and waiting. Someone fed whoever was behind this door. Someone climbed these stairs in secret and locked them again behind her. Bartholomew set the lantern down. He turned the key. The door groaned open onto a small cold room, and there, risen from a narrow cot, stood the young woman whose face he had seen at the glass. She was thin and pale, and wrapped against the chill in a worn grey shawl that had been darned 100 times. Her hair was unbound. Her eyes, enormous in the lantern light, fixed on him with a terror she fought to master, and her hand groped behind her for anything that might serve as a weapon. "I am not here to harm you," he said quickly, and stayed where he stood and let her look at him. "On my honor, my name is Bellbrook. I am a guest in this house, and I saw your face at the window, and I did not believe a word I was told about this room. Will you tell me who you are?" For a long moment she only stared, as though she had forgotten that a stranger could speak to her gently. Then her chin came up, the same dignity he would later swear he had fallen in love with in that first instant, and she said, in a voice rusty with disuse, "My name is Verina Cole, and I have been kept in this room for the better part of 3 years." 3 years, Bartholomew repeated very quietly. "Since my father died." Her hands tightened in the worn shawl. "This was his house. Mine after him. There is a paper, a settlement. My mother's people made it before she died. The estate comes to me at 25. My stepmother married him for it, and was cheated of it by his own lawyers." A bitter, exhausted breath. "So she keeps me here, where no one knows I exist, and tells the county I went abroad for my health and never came home. In a year and a half I shall be 25, Your Grace. I do not think she means for me to see it." The Duke of Bellbrook had heard a great many wicked things in his life. He had not often felt the particular cold fury that filled him now, standing in that frozen room, looking at a young woman who had been buried alive in stone for the price of a piece of paper. What struck him hardest was not the cruelty of it, but the patience of it. A blow struck in anger he could have understood. Men did wicked things in the heat of a moment and repented them after. But this was a wickedness that had climbed these stairs every day for 3 years, that had looked into this thin face morning after morning, and turned the iron key and gone calmly down to take its tea. And it took a particular strength, he thought, looking at Verina Cole's level chin, to survive being its object without going mad, to keep one's dignity intact through 3 winters of stone, waiting for a rescue one had stopped believing would ever come. "Get your shawl," he said, "and whatever you cannot bear to leave, you are not spending another night here." Verina did not move. She will say I am mad. She will say I am a thief, an impostor, that I escaped from somewhere. She has had 3 years to prepare her lies, and I have had nothing but this room. Her voice cracked just once. Why should anyone in the world believe me over a respectable widow? Why should you? Bartholomew crossed the small room. He did not touch her. He sensed she had not been touched kindly in a very long time, and would startle like a wild thing. He only crouched a little to bring his face level with hers, and held the lantern so she could see him plainly. "Because I have spent the evening being lied to by your stepmother," he said, "and the whole of my life learning to tell a true face from a false one. And because no woman invents 3 years of cold the way you wear it." He held out his hand, palm up, the way he might to a frightened horse. "I am the Duke of Bellbrook, Miss Cole. I have more lawyers than your stepmother has lies, and a name no magistrate in this country will refuse to hear. Put your hand in mine, and I give you my word before God that you will never see the inside of this tower again." Verina Cole looked at his open hand. She looked at it for a long time, the way a person looks at something she has stopped letting herself want. Then she laid her cold fingers across his palm. He brought her down the winding stair with the lantern lighting their way, his cloak around her thin shoulders. She moved slowly, unsteadily, and twice she stopped and pressed her hand flat to the cold stone wall, as though she could not quite believe the stairs were truly leading her down and out rather than to some new and crueler room. Each time Bartholomew waited without a word, holding the light, letting her find her own pace. He understood, without being told, that a woman moved against her will for 3 years must be allowed to move under her own power now, even if it took the whole night. They came out through the silent hall into the grey hour before dawn where his carriage waited. The widow did not wake until they were gone. She woke to an empty tower and an open door and a key still warm from a duke's hand, and by then it was far too late for any lie she might have told. Bartholomew did not take Verina to a magistrate that first day, nor the next. He took her to Bellbrook, to his own great warm house with its fires lit in every room, and he put her into the care of his old housekeeper and 3 motherly maids, and he sent for his physician and his attorney both, and then he left her in peace. He had learned, somewhere in his hard life, that the kindest thing one can do for a creature long kept in the dark is not to flood it with light all at once. She slept for the better part of 3 days. When she woke properly at last, washed and warmed and dressed in a soft gown the housekeeper had let out to fit her thin frame, she came down the great staircase like a woman walking in a dream, and found the Duke of Bellbrook in his library, and stopped in the doorway as though uncertain she was allowed to enter. "You may go anywhere in this house you wish," he said, rising. "Every door in it opens. That was the first thing I told the servants." Something moved in her face that was almost too much to look at. "I had forgotten," she said softly, "what it is to stand in a room I might leave." He found, in the weeks that followed, that he did not want her to leave at all. He told himself it was duty. He set his attorneys upon her stepmother with a cold and methodical fury, and they unearthed the settlement, and the false letters claiming Verina was abroad, and 2 frightened servants who confessed what they had carried up the north stair these 3 years. The case was as plain as daylight once a duke's resources were turned upon it. Mrs. Granger, who had thought herself safe in the obscurity of a forgotten girl, found the whole weight of the law descending, and fled the county before it could close around her, leaving Marsden Hall and its long-disputed settlement to the rightful heir. He came to her each evening and told her plainly what had been done that day, treating her as the rightful mistress of her own affairs. He laid the recovered settlement in her own hands the day his attorneys confirmed it, and watched her understand at last that the thing for which she had been buried alive was hers, truly, lawfully, irrevocably hers, and that no one could take it from her again. She did not weep. She had had 3 years' practice in not weeping. But she pressed the paper to her breast and closed her eyes, and Bartholomew turned away to give her the moment, and found his own throat unaccountably tight. That was duty. Bartholomew knew the difference between duty and the other thing. The other thing was the way he began to listen for her step in the gallery, the way he found himself walking the gardens at the hour he knew she liked them, to see her stand in the sun she had been so long denied, her face tilted up to it like a flower. The way she had begun slowly to laugh, a startled, rusty sound at first, then warmer, then freely, until the great cold house he had lived in alone for years was full of a sound he had not known he was missing. He watched her relearn the world in small pieces, and found each piece more dear than the last. The first time she wandered into his library uninvited, and was found an hour later curled in a window seat with a book she had simply taken down, because she wanted it. He stood in the doorway and watched her read, and thought he had never seen anything so quietly miraculous. She had been denied the smallest freedoms so long that the smallest freedoms undid her, and watching her receive them undid him in turn. He had thought himself a hard man, and discovered, that season, that he was nothing of the kind. "You stare at me, your grace," she said to him one evening, by the fire, when the worst of her thinness had softened and her hair had grown glossy again, and there was nothing left of the tower in her, but a habit of glancing, sometimes at the nearest door. She said it without fear now. She said it almost teasingly. "You have stared at me for a month. I begin to think you are waiting for me to vanish." "I am," he admitted, a little. "I keep expecting to wake and find I dreamed you, and that you are still up in that cold room, and that I was too slow, or too blind, or simply not there at all." His voice roughened. "I cannot account for it, Miss Cole, but the thought that I might never have looked up at that window, that I might have settled my tedious boundaries and ridden away, and left you to die in the dark, it visits me at night, and I cannot bear it." Verina was quiet for a moment. The fire snapped between them. "Then I shall tell you something," she said, "so that you need not bear it alone. In 3 years in that tower I prayed for many things: warmth, freedom. To see my father's gardens once more before I died." She looked at him steadily, and the lamplight caught the dignity that even 3 years of stone had never managed to break. "I never once prayed for a man to come for me, because I had stopped believing such men existed. And then you turned a key I had given up hoping anyone would turn." Her hand crept across the small space between their chairs and rested, lightly, over his. "I do not think you dreamed me, your grace. I think it is rather the other way about." Bartholomew turned his hand beneath hers, so that their fingers laced together. The second time she had given him her hand, and the first time she had done it without being afraid. "Verina," he said, and her given name in his mouth was a kind of vow. "You have your name back, and your father's house, and a fortune your stepmother will never touch. You owe me nothing. You may take all of it and go wherever in the world you please, and I will see you safely there, and count myself honored to have known you." He drew a breath. "Or you may stay. I am asking you to stay, not as a girl I rescued, but as the woman I find I cannot do without. I have lived in this great house alone a long time, and I did not know how cold it was until you filled it with laughing. Stay and be my wife, and I will spend the rest of my life making certain you never want for an open door." For a moment she did not answer, and the old tower train part of her flinched at the size of the wanting. Then she did the bravest thing she had done since the night he found her. She rose and crossed to his chair, and took his face in both her warm hands. "I have spent 3 years," she said, "learning that I could survive without anyone. I should very much like to spend the rest of them learning how to live with someone instead." She smiled, and it was the freest thing in all the firelit room. "Yes, Bartholomew, 1,000 times, yes." They were married in the spring, in the little chapel at Marsden Hall that had been her father's, with the north tower standing empty and harmless above them, and every door in the house thrown open to the sun. She wore no veil. She had had enough, she said, of being hidden. She walked to him in plain bright daylight, where all the world could see her, and gave him her hand a third time, and never afterward took it back. In the long happy years that followed, Verina would sometimes wake in the night with her heart pounding, the old fear of the cold and the dark and the locked door rising up before she was fully awake. And every time, she would reach across the bed and find his hand already reaching for hers, and the fear would go, because she remembered. She remembered that once, in the worst hour of her life, a man she had never met had climbed a forbidden stair in the dark, and turned a key no one else would turn, and crossed a cold room to tell her she would never be locked away again. And he never in all his life let her be.